Hello, fellow Janeites. We are ready for the end of our novel, and we're going to complete our discussions in this little tutorial video that I have prepared for you. So I want to start off by going over just what chapters 11 through 19 contain, including some very important scenes and, of course, very important outcomes that we see by the conclusion of the novel. So, guess who comes back to town? Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. And this is a very important moment because up until this part, we've kind of, like crossed them out of the equation by now. Jane is already convinced that there's no way that Mr. Bingley is going to come back. Elizabeth is convinced that there's no way that Mr. Darcy, after knowing what he knows about her family, he's not going to want anything to do with them. But then, lo and behold, they are back. And of course, they come to visit the Bennet sisters, and sparks fly, let me tell you. There's Mrs. Bennet, who has this, of course, she has so many stupid moments, but this one really, takes the cake. She says, while they're talking about, Mr. Wickham and Lydia getting married, she says, "Thank heaven he has some friends, though perhaps not so many as he deserves." And if you notice, this is a really underhanded jab at Darcy, because by now Mr. Wickham has spread that story of Mr. Darcy wronging him and Mr. Darcy acting so unfairly and unjustly towards him. And by now, Elizabeth knows the real truth and knows that, she can't reveal the truth to her mom, because revealing the truth to her mom and to the rest of the village also means revealing the truth about Georgiana Darcy and the fact that she did almost get eloped to Mr. Wickham. It kind of puts a little stain on her name, and she's not willing to do that. That's how much respect she has for Mr. Darcy and for the Darcy family in general. So she knows that Mrs. Bennet's comment is just so, embarrassing, first of all, but also so wrong and unjust towards Darcy, and she sees that now when she never really saw it before. Of course, we see this coming a mile away, because Mr. Bingley comes back and he's just as smitten as ever. He's totally into Jane. And finally, Jane gets the happy ending that she deserves and she's been waiting for. I put the scene here of the 2005 version of the movie, just because it has like a very cute proposal scene. And then, of course, there's Mr. Bennet, who just kind of busts in with his own remark, which is hilarious. And I wanted to share this with you. He says, "You're a good girl." And he's talking to Jane here. He says, "And I have great pleasure in thinking you will be so happily settled. I have no doubt of your doing very well together." So right now it sounds genuine, like there's Jane saying, "Oh, we're engaged," and everybody else is congratulating her. And then there's Mr. Bennet, who appears to also be congratulating her, but then of course he has to add in his sarcasm. He says, "Your tempers are by no means unlike. You are each of you so complying that nothing will ever be resolved on, so easy that every servant will cheat you, and so generous that you will always exceed your income." It's just funny just because, he's complimenting her engagement, but at the same time kind of insulting her personality. Kind of like, saying, well, both of you are really too kind and gullible. You're just going to be taken advantage of as a couple. And it's supposed to be a moment where it's a joke, but of course, like the audience, Jane doesn't take it that way. The audience, though, appreciates Mr. Bennet's sarcasm. Now, I wanted to map out a very pivotal scene for you guys. And honestly, I wish I kept looking for the proper clip so I could include it here, and I can't find it on YouTube. I do own the movie version, but if you do get a chance to watch the 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice, this is the BBC version, please make sure to pay attention to this entire exchange between Lady Catherine and Elizabeth. And it all starts, there's actually, like, I put 10 steps down, 10 key parts of their argument that I want to go over with you. Again, this will appear in our final exam, so I do want to make sure to emphasize it. Number one, Lady Catherine comes and visits Elizabeth. By the way, when you visit somebody without really a ceremony, without really letting them know first, usually people during that time, they sent letters like, I would like to call on you on this day, on this time. Is that convenient? And then, of course, by the time you reply, yes, it's convenient. And then, of course, the date is set. That's the polite thing to do. But Lady Catherine just appears out of nowhere and wants to talk to Elizabeth by herself. It's already very rude behavior. So she starts off by saying that there's a rumor that has been brought to her attention. And what is this rumor, you might wonder? Well, the rumor is that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are engaged. Now then, she continues by saying, though I know it must be a scandalous falsehood, though I would not injure him so much as to suppose the truth of it possible, I instantly resolved on setting off for this place that I might make my sentiments known to you. It's just so funny. So she's saying, I know it's a scandalous falsehood. So if you know something, then why are you coming to visit Elizabeth? And she also says, I don't want to insult him by even mentioning this rumor to him. Imagine what a condescending way to lead into this argument. No young, self-respecting woman is going to want to be spoken to in this way. And of course, Elizabeth does not like it at all. Number two, she says to Elizabeth, when Elizabeth says, well, if you know this to be true, then why are you here? And she goes on, Lady Catherine says, your arts and allurements may, in a moment of infatuation, have made him forget what he owes to himself and to all his family. You may have drawn him in. Imagine, you may have basically seduced my nephew. That's what she's accusing him of. This is a real insult on her character, to accuse Elizabeth of being a seductress of all things. And this is a lady, an aristocrat. She should know better. She should be the authority when it comes to manners. And yet she's acting so rudely with this young woman who doesn't really deserve to be put down and insulted in this way. And then, of course, Lady Catherine, number 3, goes on and says that she has a right to know all of Darcy's concerns since, and this is her reasoning, she is almost the nearest relation he has in the world. I mean, let's just take a moment and laugh over the fact that she's the almost nearest relation. So it's like, I am almost the closest thing he has in the world because we know he has his sister, he also has his cousin. There's people that precede her, and she thinks that that's a good enough reason to know all of his concerns. Makes absolutely no sense. Number 4, she then declares that Mr. Darcy is engaged to her daughter. And she thinks that this is a premise that is going to finally convince Elizabeth to reject Darcy. Basically saying that, well, he's already engaged. What are you doing getting engaged to this man? Which, by the way, if you really, look at this objectively, to accuse her nephew of already being engaged and to also be engaged to Elizabeth is really putting down her nephew's character at this point. But she doesn't care. But then she goes on and says, well, the engagement is a peculiar kind of engagement. This already is making us think, okay, lady, is it real engagement or not? What the hell are you even talking about? And of course, we find out that it's not really an engagement. It's just a desire that she and Darcy's mom had when they were infants. So imagine, like kind of like moms saying, oh, when our kids grow up, they should get married. And now, she's saying that's an engagement. That's not an engagement. That's just a desire that you had for an engagement in the future. Of course, Mr. Darcy has enough ranking not to be in an arranged marriage. He has the right to choose his own wife. And then, of course, there's Elizabeth who hypothetically says, well, why shouldn't I accept his proposal? And she's speaking hypothetically at this point. Lady Catherine's argument, because honor, decorum, prudence, and then she adds, and interest forbid it. And, why interest? Isn't this a very good question to ask? Like, she's basically saying, it will not be in your best interest to accept my nephew's proposal. So why though, you might wonder? Because you will be censored, slighted, despised by everyone connected with him. So notice like the series of events that have not yet passed that she's predicting, to basically be ignored and to be disowned by the rest of the family. That it's a family that Elizabeth doesn't even know necessarily. Why would that be a cause for her to reject Mr. Darcy if she loves him? Just her reasoning doesn't quite make sense. She's predicting that all these things will happen if she does accept Darcy, and that it's not in her best interest to do so. And of course, when Elizabeth just keeps, evading all these questions, Lady Catherine calls her, and I have a t-shirt that has this phrase on it, by the way. She calls her an obstinate, headstrong girl. I love it. Like accusing her of being stubborn and headstrong. And then, of course, one last attempt, Lady Catherine says, is this your gratitude for my attentions to you last spring? Is nothing due to me on that score? Like, as in, don't you have a conscience, Elizabeth? Don't you owe me gratitude for how much attention I showed you? For all the times that I invited you to dine at Rosings Park? I mean, hello, you should be thanking me. And of course, she's not seeing the ridiculousness of her claims at this point. Of course, she goes on insulting Elizabeth and saying that you have no family connections or fortune. But then Elizabeth defends herself here by saying, Darcy is a gentleman and I am a gentleman's daughter. So far we are equal. This is so interesting to think about because it's true. They are both, Mr. Bennet and Darcy, from the gentry. They are both landowners. They both have estates. Of course, Mr. Darcy's estate is way grander, but Mr. Bennet also has an estate. He also has a proper title, and he's also part of the landed gentry. But then Lady Catherine doesn't accept this. Why? Because of Elizabeth's mother. And she says, who was your mother? Who are your uncles and aunts? Do not imagine me ignorant of their condition. Basically trying to pinpoint the fact that Mr. Bennet married beneath him and that her mother, Elizabeth's mother, is not worthy enough to be a mother-in-law to Mr. Darcy. And then, of course, she mentions Lydia's elopement, which, it's a pretty legitimate reason not to want to have ties to such a family. An elopement at that time was scandalous. And finally, leading to that last part where she says, and this is her famous line, are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? And imagine, Elizabeth, this is the metaphor. Elizabeth is the pollution. And she's basically going to diminish the importance of Pemberley, the historical value of that estate. And that's why she is an unfeeling, selfish girl. And that's what Lady Catherine ultimately accuses Elizabeth of being. And that, in a nutshell, is the entirety of the argument and all of the accusations and also the premises that Lady Catherine lays forth.